Let us begin with a fact that Victorian society considered too obvious to state and too important to examine, which is precisely why it deserves to be stated and examined immediately. A gentleman of consequence in the London of 1863 could, on the evening of his own wedding, leave his bride sitting alone in the ducal bedchamber and ride across the city to the townhouse of a woman he found considerably more entertaining, and provided he did not make the mistake of telling anyone who would tell someone else, this departure would be considered, in the relevant circles, a matter between himself and his conscience. His conscience, in most such cases, was doing excellent work elsewhere and could not be reached for comment. Society, that magnificent and terrible organism, would continue to turn on its axis as though nothing had happened, because nothing, by its reckoning, had. What society had not adequately accounted for, in the case of Caspian Aldrich Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Ashcroft, was that the woman he left sitting alone in the ducal bedchamber on the 15th of May, 1863, was not, in any measurable sense, sitting. She was at his writing desk. And she had been writing for approximately 40 minutes before the carriage wheels on the drive below had fully ceased their echoing, and she was going to keep writing until she had finished, because Lady Isolde Cavendish, née Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft as of 6 hours ago, a title she was still privately finding slightly absurd, had never in her life left a thought unfinished simply because the circumstances suggested she ought to be doing something else. She dipped her pen. She wrote. And somewhere across London, in a very tastefully appointed townhouse in Mayfair, the Duke of Ashcroft was discovering that his evening was about to go considerably less according to plan than he had anticipated. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Good stories, like good marriages, the few that actually exist, require a proper beginning. This one begins, as most catastrophes in the London season do, with an introduction at a dinner party. The dinner party was Lady Hartfield's. The occasion was the opening week of the 1863 season. The introduction was performed by Lady Hartfield herself, who had the particular talent of the well-intentioned matchmaker, which is to say she approached the arranging of other people's futures with tremendous warmth and almost no understanding of either party's actual character. She placed them beside each other at the table with the satisfied expression of a woman who has done an excellent thing, and then she turned to the guest on her left and essentially forgot about them, which was the best possible thing she could have done for both parties and which she would never know. Caspian Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Ashcroft, was 32 years old, insufferably handsome in the specific way of men who have been told so since birth and have allowed the information to do substantial structural damage to their personalities, possessed of a title, an estate, a London house, an income that made other incomes feel inadequate, and the serene confidence of someone who has never been told no by anything except his tailor, who remained firm on certain points of lapel width. He had been the most eligible bachelor in London for the better part of 7 years and had spent all 7 of those years demonstrating that eligible was not the same as interested. He had a mistress, Mrs. Lavinia Pemberton, a widow of impeccable taste and considerable wit who had been the Duke's primary entertainment for 3 years and who operated under no illusions whatsoever about the nature of their arrangement, which she found quite satisfactory and he found convenient, and which they had both agreed, in the easy shorthand of people who understand each other precisely, would continue until it did not. He required a wife because his mother had issued an ultimatum of the sort that ducal mothers issue when the succession has been left unattended for 7 years and they have developed a nervous complaint in consequence. The ultimatum was clear: marry by 33 or she would begin appearing at breakfast unannounced. He had assessed this threat with the seriousness it deserved and concluded that marriage was, on balance, preferable. Lady Isolde Hartwell was 26 years old, the eldest daughter of Lord Hartfield, a man of excellent title, moderate fortune, and the winning quality of having died 3 years ago before he could do too much additional damage to either. She had dark hair worn simply, grey eyes that operated at a level of assessment most people found slightly uncomfortable, and the kind of face that rewarded longer looking with the specific discovery that it was considerably more interesting than a first impression suggested, which was, as it happened, an accurate metaphor for everything else about her. She had been educated by a father who believed women ought to be able to manage their own affairs, and subsequently by the experience of actually managing her family's affairs for 3 years, which had produced in her an efficiency and a clarity of thought that the marriage market found both appealing in the abstract and faintly alarming in practice. She had declined 4 proposals. Not cruelly, not by the malicious exercise of power, but with the honest directness of someone who had examined the available options and found them wanting by specific and articulable criteria. The proposals had come from men who were kind and dull, and who would have provided comfortable lives in which nothing interesting ever happened, and she had looked at those lives as they were presented to her and had said, politely but without ambiguity, that she preferred her current arrangement. Her current arrangement, by the spring of 1863, was becoming untenable. Her mother was anxious. Her younger sister required a season. The family's finances were not catastrophic but were becoming what her father's solicitor called increasingly legible, which was solicitor language for visible to the wrong people. Something was required. Something turned out to be the dinner party at Lady Hartfield's, and the gentleman placed beside her at the table, and the conversation that followed. The conversation was, by any reasonable assessment, a disaster. This is not to say it was unpleasant. It was not unpleasant at all, which was arguably the problem. It was sharp and combative and funny in the way that conversations are funny when both people are genuinely intelligent and neither has any interest in performing for the other, and it covered, in the space of 2 courses and a pudding, the current state of parliamentary reform, the particular failure of a recently published novel that both of them had read and both of them had found wanting for different and precisely articulated reasons, and the question of whether the Elgin marbles constituted a trophy or a rescue, on which subject they disagreed with considerable vigor and absolutely no resolution. It was, in other words, the best dinner conversation Isolde had experienced in 3 seasons. And it was with a man she found, simultaneously, so thoroughly convinced of his own correctness about everything that agreeing to spend her life in his company seemed like consigning herself to a very elegant form of intellectual warfare. She considered this on the carriage ride home, with her mother providing commentary in the adjacent seat. "He is exceptionally well favored," her mother said. "He is," Isolde agreed. "He also believes that the Elgin marbles are in England because they are safer here, which is the argument of every man who has ever taken something that didn't belong to him and needed to sleep at night. His income is 70,000 a year." "His income is 70,000 a year," Isolde agreed. "And the Ashcroft estate in Kent is one of the finest in the county." "I am sure it is." Her mother looked at her with the expression she had developed over 26 years of this kind of conversation, which was the expression of a woman who loves her daughter very much and finds her, specifically and consistently, exhausting. "Isolde." "Yes." "Will you consider it?" Isolde looked out the window at London going past in the spring night, all gaslit and busy with its own considerable opinion of itself. She thought about the conversation at dinner. About the way he had argued, wrong about the marbles, but sharp, actually sharp, in the way that required the real version of her rather than the managed version. About his laugh, which had arrived once, briefly, when she had said something he had not expected, and which had the quality of something genuine in a face that was otherwise performing its public version. She thought about 70,000 a year and the Kent estate and her sister Susan and the solicitor's phrase about legibility. "I will consider it," she said. She considered it for approximately 3 weeks, during which he called 4 times and she received him with the composed courtesy of a woman who is simultaneously conducting an assessment and declining to advertise this fact. She found, across the 4 visits, that her initial impression held. He was sharp. He was funny, in the dry, self-aware way she valued most. He was also, structurally, a man who had been the most important person in every room he had ever entered for 32 years and had developed, in consequence, a set of assumptions about how things worked that were so thoroughly embedded he could no longer see them as assumptions. He assumed that his opinion was the correct starting point for any discussion. He assumed that women in drawing rooms were performing interest rather than feeling it. He assumed that the world was arranged, at the level that mattered, for his convenience, and that this arrangement was not only natural but practically invisible, like gravity, simply the way things were. Isolde could see every one of these assumptions with the effortless precision of someone who had spent 26 years in rooms where they operated, and she had arrived, by the end of the 4th visit, at a conclusion that she found simultaneously logical and faintly exhilarating. She was going to marry him. Not because the assumptions did not bother her. They bothered her considerably. But because a man with assumptions that visible was a man whose assumptions could be examined, and examined assumptions could, in the fullness of time and with the application of sufficient intelligence and patience, be revised. And because 70,000 a year meant her sister could have her season and the solicitor could find another phrase, and because she was 26 and had already declined everyone else, and because the conversation about the Elgin marbles had been genuinely the most entertaining 40 minutes of her last 3 seasons. She told her mother she would accept. Her mother wept with relief, which Isolde found moving in the specific way of things that are both theatrical and sincere simultaneously. The Duke, informed of this outcome by Lord Hartfield's solicitor through the usual channels, was neither moved nor theatrical. He said, through his own solicitor, that the settlement terms were acceptable. He told his secretary to arrange the announcement. He told Mrs. Lavinia Pemberton, over dinner at her Mayfair townhouse on a Thursday, that he was going to be married and that this would not, he saw no reason why it should, substantially alter their existing arrangement. Lavinia had looked at him with the dark, amused eyes of a woman who has found the male species consistently entertaining for 15 years and shows no signs of stopping. She had poured his wine with the ease of long familiarity and the slight, private quality of a woman who has already made a decision she has not yet shared. "What is she like?" she had asked. "Intelligent," he said. "Argumentative. Rather good on parliamentary reform." "You mean you argued with her and she won?" "I mean we had a stimulating exchange of views." "Darling," Lavinia said, "you have never in your life described a woman as intelligent in that tone of voice unless she has bested you at something. That tone," she gestured, lightly, with her wine glass, "is the tone of a man who has encountered an argument he cannot finish and has decided the encounter was stimulating rather than humbling, which is a distinction with very little daylight between them." He had moved past this with the efficiency of a man who does not wish to examine it further, but not before Lavinia had looked at him with the expression she wore when she had understood something thoroughly and was deciding whether to say the rest of it. She had said, "I find that I am quite interested in your wife." He had said that this seemed premature. She had said, "Most things worth being interested in seem premature at the beginning." He had not known, sitting at Lavinia's table in the Mayfair townhouse, that he would not be sitting in again, that she was already composing the letter, that she had already decided on Paris and the 12th of May and the word clarifying, which she had selected with the specific care of a woman who chooses words the way good writers do, not for comfort but for accuracy. He had not known any of this, because Lavinia was excellent at knowing things before she was ready to say them, which was one of the qualities he had most valued in their arrangement and which was, he would understand later, a gift she had been giving him for the entire length of it. The engagement lasted 2 months. During those 2 months, they met on 7 occasions, all properly chaperoned, all conducted with the specific, slightly formal quality of 2 people who are circling something neither of them has named. The conversations were good, reliably, consistently good, which was more than could be said for most engagements Isolde had observed from a distance, which tended toward the performatively romantic and the substantively empty. They argued about Gladstone and the taxation of income and the question of whether Middlemarch was a novel about marriage or a novel about the failure of available options for women, on which they had opposing views and neither would concede, which Isolde privately found very encouraging about the marriage's prospects for entertainment, even if she found his position on Middlemarch wrong-headed in the specific, articulate way of a man who has not allowed the possibility that the book might be about something that does not primarily concern him. He gave her a ring, sapphires, very beautiful, clearly selected by someone with taste. She thanked him with the genuine warmth of someone who appreciates beautiful things and the slight qualification of someone who notes that the ring communicates ownership as much as affection, which she decided was too philosophically involved for a thank you note and kept to herself. The note she sent was warm and precise and thanked him for the sapphires specifically and not for the gesture in general, because she found specific gratitude more honest than general gratitude and because specificity in appreciation, she had learned, told people more about you than any amount of general warmth. He read the note, Phoebe reported via her intelligence network, twice. Isolde found this information satisfying in a way she attributed to the natural pleasure of being received accurately and chose not to examine further. He told her, on the occasion of their 5th meeting, that he kept a separate establishment. He said this with the particular, carefully calibrated delivery of a man who has rehearsed the sentence and has decided that directness is both more honorable and more efficient than the alternative. He said it plainly, without apology, and watched her face with the expression of a man who has prepared for several possible responses and has arranged his own responses to those responses in advance, which she recognized as a form of intelligence even if it was also, in this instance, slightly infuriating in its confidence. Isolde received this information with approximately the same expression she would have used if he had told her the weather forecast. "I see," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I think that is a better foundation than what?" she said. A pause. "Than pretense." She looked at him steadily. He had, she noticed, the expression of a man who has said a difficult thing and is prepared for various responses and has prepared various responses to those responses. He looked, in this moment, genuinely uncertain, which was the first time she had seen genuine uncertainty on his face, and she found it considerably more interesting than his certainty. Certainty in a man was common. Uncertainty, honestly worn, was considerably rarer and considerably more trustworthy. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I appreciate the honesty." He looked faintly unsatisfied with this response, which she suspected was because he had not prepared for it and did not know what to do with composure in a situation designed to produce the opposite. She decided that this was, all things considered, an acceptable beginning. A man who found her composure slightly disconcerting was a man who was paying attention. Paying attention was the only starting point that mattered. The wedding was at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 15th of May. It was a beautiful day, which was wasted on both parties in different ways, on the Duke, who noticed it with the brief acknowledgement of a man whose mind was on logistics, and on Isolde, who noticed it with genuine appreciation and then spent the carriage ride to the church constructing, in the privacy of her own thoughts, the opening paragraph of something she had been wanting to write for quite some time. The ceremony itself proceeded with the irreversible momentum of all ceremonies designed to be irreversible. The church was full of people, which is to say it was full of witnesses, which is what people at weddings primarily are, regardless of what they believe themselves to be. The vows were spoken. The Duke's voice was steady and his expression was composed. Isolde's voice was equally steady and her expression was equally composed, which she noted caused a slight adjustment in his expression, as though he had expected something different and was revising in real time. What he had expected, she suspected, was something softer. Something that looked more like a woman arriving at the moment she had been waiting for her entire life, which was the performance of Brides at St. George's and which was not available from Isolde, who had been waiting for a great many things in her life and none of them had been this specifically. They signed the register. They processed out of the church through a corridor of guests making the particular noise of people who are celebrating a thing they do not fully understand. There was a wedding breakfast of the usual comprehensive and slightly punishing variety, during which Isolde sat beside her new husband and had a conversation that was actually quite good about the Ashcroft estate's water management. He had opinions, and they were mostly correct, and she had refinements, and he received 2 of them and dismissed the third, which she filed away for later, and during which her mother wept twice more, joyfully, and her sister Cecily looked at the Duke with the expression of a 19-year-old encountering a genuinely attractive man in formal wear for the first time and looked away again when he glanced back, which was the correct social response and which Isolde noted with quiet approval. There were toasts. There was champagne. There was a performance of collective goodwill that everyone present executed with varying degrees of genuine feeling and professional competence. Then there was the carriage ride to Ashcroft House, which was, by any assessment, the best conversation they had yet managed, because they were alone for the first time, without the machinery of social occasion around them, and they were both intelligent enough to understand that the next several hours were significant and both too composed to acknowledge this directly, which produced a conversation that was simultaneously about 3 other things and entirely about the fact that they were alone in a carriage going to a house where they lived now, and both of them were conscious of this in different registers. He told her about the house. Which rooms were best in the morning. The library, which she would, he thought, find well stocked. The garden, which wanted attention and which he had not had time for. He said this with the quality of a man managing a conversation he is uncertain how to have by filling it with content he is comfortable with, which she found both transparent and charming, and she received it with genuine interest because she had, in fact, been wondering about the library. She told him about her reading habits. That she was in the middle of 3 things simultaneously, which was her standard operating condition and something she considered a feature rather than a flaw. That she would need a writing desk in her rooms, a proper one, not a decorative escritoire but an actual working desk with sufficient surface area for papers to accumulate without causing a structural crisis. He looked at her. "You write," he said. "I do," she said. A slight pause, in which she could see him processing this and deciding that writing was an acceptable hobby for a wife and that he did not need to know more. She did not offer more. They arrived at Ashcroft House, which was exactly as magnificent as its reputation suggested, a Mayfair townhouse of such precise and well-maintained grandeur that it communicated money not through ostentation but through the quiet confidence of things that have always been excellent and expect to continue. The staff were assembled. The introductions were made. The housekeeper, Mrs. Groves, a woman of 50 with the expression of someone who has managed large households through many varieties of human complication and expects to continue doing so indefinitely with or without the cooperation of the principals, looked at Isolde with the assessing eye of a person who is determining what kind of problem the new Duchess is going to be assessed, and arrived at a provisional conclusion that seemed satisfactory, because she said, "Your Grace," with something that was almost warmth and showed Isolde to her rooms with what might have been genuine pleasure. There were 23 staff members. Isolde memorized all 23 names with the focused efficiency of someone who believes that knowing people's names is a minimum standard of basic courtesy and should not be treated as an exceptional virtue. Mrs. Groves watched her do this with the expression of a woman revising her provisional conclusion upward. The rooms were lovely. Large, well-proportioned, with tall windows overlooking the garden and a fireplace that was already lit against the May chill. The furniture was good and the fabrics were good, and someone, she suspected Mrs. Groves, acting on some instinct of welcome, had put fresh flowers on the mantelpiece, which she found genuinely touching. There was, she noted with approval, a writing desk. Not a decorative escritoire. An actual desk, broad-surfaced and practical, positioned near the window. She stood before it for a moment with the appreciative attention of someone who recognizes the right tool when she sees it. She did not know if it had always been there or if it had been placed there on her husband's instruction before the wedding, and she decided that either answer told her something worth knowing and that she would determine which one later. She changed out of the wedding dress with the assistance of her new maid, Perkins, a composed and efficient woman of 30 who performed the complicated business of unpinning the gown and its 14 associated mechanisms with the focused competence of a professional who understands that this is one of those evenings where the less said the better. Isolde changed into a dressing gown of grey silk and sat at the dressing table while Perkins dealt with the various architectural achievements of the bridal hairstyle, and she thought about the evening. The Duke knocked at the connecting door at 9:30. He was dressed for going out, which was information she received without surprise and with the specific, particular quality of a feeling she had known was coming but found, in its actual arrival, slightly different from what she had anticipated. Not more painful than expected. She had expected it to be painful and had already, in the 3 weeks since his disclosure, done the work of deciding that it was manageable, which it was. Slightly more clarifying. The way that certain things, when they actually happen, make you understand yourself more precisely than the anticipation did. She said, "Good evening." He looked at her. She was sitting at the dressing table with the calm composure of someone who had been expecting this and had decided, in advance, what their face was going to do. He looked as though he had also been expecting this and had prepared for several possible versions of how it would go, and was finding, again, that she had not chosen any of the versions he had prepared for. "I won't be long," he said. "Take your time," she said. "I have things to attend to." A pause. He looked at the writing desk, which was, she noted the direction of his gaze, exactly what he was looking at. Then he looked back at her, and there was, briefly, something in his expression that she had no immediate name for. Something that was not guilt exactly, and not discomfort exactly, but was adjacent to both and had the quality of a man who has done something he prepared to do and finds that the doing of it is different from the preparation. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said, and returned her attention to the mirror. She heard him go. She heard his footsteps descend the main stairs, heard the low exchange with the butler, heard the front door open and close and the carriage, already ordered, she noted, already arranged, which meant this had been planned with the administrative efficiency of a man who takes logistics seriously, pull away from the house. She sat for a moment at the dressing table, looking at herself in the mirror with the honest, unsentimental attention she brought to most things. She looked at the grey silk dressing gown and the unpinned hair and the new sapphire ring on her left hand and the room behind her reflected in the glass, large and lovely and entirely still. Then she went to the desk. She had been composing it in her head for 3 weeks. Since the conversation in which he had told her about the separate establishment with the careful directness of a man who has decided that honesty is both more honorable and more efficient, she had been turning it over, the way you turn a thing in your mind before you put it on the page, working out the structure, the cadence, the precise pitch of the voice. She had been thinking about it in the carriage to the church and at the wedding breakfast and during the toast by his best man, Lord Aldous Fry, who had delivered a speech of such cheerful, unconscious condescension about the Duke's finally being obliged to settle down that she had composed 2 entire paragraphs in response to it while appearing to smile at the appropriate moments. She uncapped the inkwell. She arranged the paper. She set the pen to the page, and she wrote. The essay was titled, On the Institution of Matrimony as Practiced in the English Aristocracy of 1863, being a modest assessment by a gentleman of considerable experience. The author, as bylined, was one A. Hartwell, Esquire, a name she had selected with the care of someone who understands that the best pseudonyms are simultaneously invisible and, to the right reader at the right moment, perfectly legible. She had chosen a masculine pen name not from any belief that the essay required masculine authority to be taken seriously, but from the precise, practical understanding that an essay of this nature, published under a woman's name, would be received as personal grievance, which it was not, whereas the same essay under a man's name would be received as social observation, which it also was and which was the point. The essay opened, It has been my observation, conducted across 32 years of English society and latterly confirmed by intimate acquaintance with its most exquisite machinery, that the institution of marriage among the English aristocracy functions less as a union of persons than as a merger of assets, conducted with the emotional warmth of a property conveyance and the lasting significance of a 3-year lease. The principles involved are selected not for compatibility of character, which would require the principals' characters to have been genuinely examined, but for compatibility of circumstance, title meeting fortune, estate meeting income, the combined result being the production of further titles, fortunes, and estates to be similarly disposed of in the subsequent generation. The principles themselves are largely incidental to this process. They are present at the ceremony in the same way that the parish church is present, as the vessel through which the transaction is sanctified, and approximately as consulted. She paused. She read it back. She felt, as she always felt when a sentence had arrived correctly, the specific, small, intensely private satisfaction of precision. She had not felt it in quite this way before, or not in relation to this subject, and she found it clarifying in ways that she had not anticipated. She continued. She wrote for 4 hours. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the progress of the night in its steady, indifferent way, 10 o'clock, 11, midnight, 1, and Isolde wrote through all of it with the focused absorption of someone who has found the thing their brain is best at and is giving it the full range of their intelligence. She wrote about the selection process with the precision of a naturalist documenting a species. She wrote about the wedding ceremony with the dry observation of someone who has just performed it and found the experience illuminating in several ways that the ceremony itself did not invite comment upon. She wrote about the wedding breakfast, about the toasts, about the particular variety of goodwill displayed by people who are celebrating not two individuals but the institution that has just consumed them. She wrote, with tremendous care and a quality of restraint that she recognized would make it funnier than excess would have, about the wedding night as a concept, its mythology, its management by society, the precise and elaborate machinery by which English aristocratic culture arranged an event of potential genuine intimacy into a performance of correct procedure. She did not write about her husband specifically. She was too intelligent for that and too careful and had no interest in personal attack, which was both a moral position and an aesthetic one. Personal attack was easier and less interesting than structural observation, and she was going for the structure. The essay was not about Caspian Cavendish. It was about the system that had produced Caspian Cavendish and 1,000 men before him and would produce 1,000 men after him, the system that arranged men and women into institutional configurations and called the arrangement love and wondered, with genuine puzzlement, why love sometimes failed to materialize on schedule. She wrote, near the end, one arrives at the conclusion that the English aristocratic marriage, considered as a system, is not designed to produce happiness, because happiness is an individual quality and systems are not interested in individuals. It is designed to produce continuity, of title, of property, of the arrangement itself. It is extraordinarily successful at this objective. The arrangement has continued for several centuries without significant structural modification, which speaks well of its engineering and not at all of the people inside it, who are, one observes, still attempting to find within its prescribed dimensions the thing the system was never designed to contain, which is simply the company of someone who sees them clearly and finds them worth the seeing. She put down the pen. She read the essay from beginning to end with the cold, revisionary eye she applied to everything she wrote, which was the eye that had no investment in what was on the page but only in whether it was correct. She made 7 small corrections and 1 structural adjustment in the penultimate paragraph. Then she read it again. It was good. It was, she thought, with the slightly stunned quality of recognizing something you have not previously understood about your own capabilities, it was better than good. It was the best thing she had written, and she had been writing seriously for 6 years, and she knew the difference between good and better than good in her own work with the accuracy of someone who has read enough of other people's work to have reliable calibration. She folded the pages. She addressed an envelope to the literary editor of the London Quarterly Review, to whose publication she had twice before submitted essays under less charged pseudonyms and which had twice before published them to a reception she had read with the private pleasure of someone whose work is being discussed by people who do not know who wrote it. She sealed the envelope. She wrote a brief covering letter in the persona of A. Hartwell, Esquire, noting that the enclosed essay was offered for consideration and that responses might be directed to a postal address she maintained precisely for this purpose, a detail she had arranged, with the forward planning of someone who thinks about logistics, 2 weeks before the wedding. She rang for the night footman. She was aware, as she did so, that it was 1:30 in the morning of the 16th of May, 1863, which was technically the first morning of her marriage, and that she was sending an essay to a literary periodical, which was not the conventional first act of a duchess. She found she was entirely at peace with this. The footman arrived with the expression of someone who has been in service long enough to convey that whatever is required will be performed without comment. She handed him the envelope and instructed him to ensure it was dispatched with the first morning post. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Good night." She went to bed at 1:45 and was asleep by 2 o'clock with the deep, productive sleep of someone who has spent an evening well. Across London, in the tastefully appointed Mayfair town house, the Duke of Ashcroft had by this point been sitting in Mrs. Lavinia Pemberton's drawing-room for an hour speaking to Mrs. Lavinia Pemberton's butler, whose name was Garrett, who was 53, imperturbable, and in possession of a letter. The letter was from Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Pemberton, the letter explained in her clear, elegant hand, had departed for Paris on the 12th of May. She had gone with her cousin, Lady Marjorie Featherstone, who was recovering from an unpleasant winter and required the southern air and the general improvement of Parisian society, both of which were unavailable in London in May if you had been there all winter and found it, by the 12th, insufficiently stimulating. Mrs. Pemberton sent her regards. She sent her congratulations on the forthcoming marriage, which she had read about in the Morning Post and which she had found, she wrote, and this was the sentence that required the Duke to read it 3 times to ensure he had parsed it correctly, rather clarifying. Clarifying. The word sat on the page with the composed finality of something that means exactly what it says and is aware of this. There was a postscript. The postscript said, "I suspect your wife is going to be considerably more interesting than either of you presently believe. Do write from Kent this summer. The address in Paris is enclosed." He sat in Lavinia's drawing room, her absent drawing room, her Paris-bound drawing room, for a further 20 minutes with the letter in his hand and the particular quality of a man who has planned an evening with the logistical care of a general and arrived at the battlefield to discover that the battle has been relocated without notice to a different country. He drove home through the London night with the letter in his coat pocket and the feeling of having been, in some way he could not yet fully articulate, outmaneuvered by an opponent who was not even present. He arrived at Ashcroft House at 2:30. The house was quiet. He let himself in, which he did when arriving late because it seemed unnecessary to rouse the household for the purpose of opening a door, and he stood in the entrance hall for a moment in the particular silence of a large house at night, which is the deepest silence available in a city because it is contained silence, the silence of many rooms holding their breath. There was a light under the door of the library. He went to the library. He opened the door and found, sitting in the large chair by the fire with a book open in her lap, his wife. She was in the grey dressing gown, which she had clearly been wearing all evening, and her hair was still down, and she had what he would later come to recognize as her reading face, the expression of someone so thoroughly inside a text that the external world requires active effort to re-enter, the expression he would have described, before tonight, as abstracted, and would describe, after it, as something considerably more specific than that. She looked up. The fire was low but still warm, and in its light she looked. He registered this with the slight surprise of a man encountering an observation he was not expecting to make, very much herself. Not the wedding-dressed, ceremony-composed version of herself that had stood beside him at St. George's. Simply herself, in a chair, at 2:30 in the morning, reading, in the house that was now hers. "You're back," she said. "I am," he said. A brief silence. She held the book loosely. He stood in the doorway. The fire made its small, domestic sounds. "How was your evening?" she asked, with the perfectly calibrated tone of someone who is asking a question rather than making an accusation, and who is aware that the distinction is significant, and who is deploying it with precision. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket. He thought about Lavinia in Paris and the word clarifying and the postscript about his wife being more interesting than either of them believed. "Instructive," he said. Her mouth did something small. "Mine also," she said. "There is port on the sideboard if you want it." He poured himself a glass and sat in the chair across from her, because he had arrived home at 2:30 in the morning and his wife was in the library reading and offering port, and he found that he did not know what to do with any of these facts and that sitting down and having port seemed like the most reasonable response available. "What are you reading?" he said. She held up the cover. "Mills on Liberty." "At 2:30 in the morning," he said. "Time is not a criterion I apply to Mill," she said. "He is useful whenever he is useful." He drank his port. She returned to Mill. The fire settled. The clock in the corner marked the half-hour. It was, he thought, the strangest first night of a marriage that had ever been spent in this house, which had housed 5 dukes and their attendant duchesses across 140 years, and he was relatively certain none of them had spent it in the library with port and Mill and the quality of silence that was present in the room now, which was not uncomfortable. This surprised him. He had expected, coming in, the comfortable discomfort of a night that had gone wrong in a specific and expected way. He had expected an atmosphere. He had expected something he would need to navigate. He had found, instead, a woman sitting in a chair with a book, who had offered him port and asked a question rather than making a speech, and who seemed, in every observable way, to be getting on perfectly well. He was not entirely sure what to do with this. "I owe you an apology," he said, because he had decided in the carriage that honesty was better and he was going to maintain this position regardless of how the evening had gone, which was, in its own way, the decision of a man with some actual principles. She looked up from Mill. "For what, specifically?" He looked at her. "For tonight." "Ah," she said. A pause. "I appreciate the apology, though I should tell you that I was perfectly occupied." "I see that." "The desk in my room is excellent," she said. "I worked for 4 hours." A pause. "Very productively." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the grey eyes that had been assessing things since the dinner party at Lady Hartfield's and would, he was beginning to understand, continue to do so with comprehensive thoroughness for the foreseeable future. "What were you working on?" he said. "An essay," she said. "About?" She considered the question for a moment. "Marriage," she said. as a structural phenomenon. He absorbed this. And how did you find it? The essay? A small smile. I thought it came out rather well. She returned to Mill, and then, after a moment, added, marriage as a structural phenomenon I find more complicated, but early days. He finished his port. He said good night. She said good night, already partially back inside the text. He went up to bed and lay in the dark ceiling of the ducal bedroom with Lavinia's letter on the nightstand and the word clarifying still doing its quiet work in his head, and he thought about the library downstairs and the grey dressing gown and the desk at which his wife had spent the first 4 hours of their marriage writing an essay about marriage, which was either very funny or very alarming or possibly both simultaneously, and he fell asleep before he had decided which. The essay was published in the London Quarterly Review on the 1st of June. The London Quarterly Review arrived at breakfast tables across the city on a Thursday morning, as it always did, with the composed reliability of a publication that has been arriving at breakfast tables on Thursdays for 40 years and expects to continue. It arrived at Ashcroft House on the same Thursday morning and was placed, by the footman, on the breakfast table in the position it always occupied, which was to the left of the coffee service and to the right of whatever letters had accumulated overnight. Isolde was at breakfast when it arrived. She had been at breakfast for 20 minutes, having risen early, as she generally did, for the solid practical reason that mornings before the household fully animated themselves were the most reliably quiet and therefore the most reliably productive. She was eating toast and reading correspondence when the review was placed before her, and she turned to it with the slight adjustment of a woman moving from one form of reading to another, opened it to the contents page, and found, on page 47, the essay. She read it as it appeared in print, which was different from reading it in manuscript, because print has a quality of finality that manuscript does not, and reading her own words in someone else's typography with someone else's page layout was always the most accurate way she had found to determine whether something worked or only seemed to work in the intimate context of the writing desk. The essay worked. It worked rather better than she had hoped, and she found this enormously satisfying in the specific, clean way of things that come out as intended and better. She put the review down and ate the rest of her toast. The Duke came to breakfast 20 minutes later, which was later than his usual time because he had a meeting at 10 and had been reviewing papers in his study. He sat, accepted coffee, accepted the review from the footman, and opened it to the parliamentary coverage, which was where he generally began because politics was where things of consequence happened and one liked to be current. He read the parliamentary coverage. He drank his coffee. He turned pages. He arrived, on page 47, at the essay. Isolde was writing a letter. She was aware, with the peripheral awareness of someone who is watching something without appearing to watch it, of the precise moment he began reading, which was identifiable by the slight stillness that settled over him, the specific quality of a man who has encountered something on a page that has arrested his attention more thoroughly than he had prepared for. He read for approximately 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she had read it herself in 3:45, and she allowed for the possibility that he read slightly slower when encountering unexpected things. Then he set the review down and looked across the breakfast table. "Have you read this?" he said. She looked up from her letter with the expression of someone mildly interrupted. "Which piece?" "Page 47. An essay." He paused. "On marriage." "Oh," she said. He picked it up again and read, aloud, with the voice of a man who is quoting something because he needs to hear it spoken in order to fully process it. "The principles involved are selected not for compatibility of character, which would require the principals' characters to have been genuinely examined, but for compatibility of circumstance, title meeting fortune, estate meeting income, the combined result being the production of further titles, fortunes, and estates to be similarly disposed of in the subsequent generation." He put it down. "What do you think of that?" "I think," Isolde said carefully, "that it is rather precisely observed." He looked at her. "It's brutal." "It is honest," she said. "Those are different things, though they sometimes look similar." He picked up the review again and read further, and then further still, and Isolde continued writing her letter, which was to her solicitor, about a matter she had been intending to address since before the wedding and had not yet found the right moment for, and the breakfast room was quiet except for the sound of the clock and the distant movements of the house beginning its morning. "He's right about the wedding breakfast," the Duke said, after a further 2 minutes. Isolde looked up. "I beg your pardon." "The bit about the wedding breakfast." He found the page, the performance of collective goodwill that everyone present executes with varying degrees of genuine feeling and professional competence. He looked at her. "He's right about that." "Is he?" she said. "Aldous Fry's toast," he said, with the tone of a man revisiting something. "Professional competence at best." "I thought your best man's toast was rather revealing," Isolde agreed. "In several ways he did not intend." The Duke laughed. It was the same laugh she had produced at the dinner party at Lady Hartfield's, the brief, genuine, slightly surprised version, the one that arrived before it had been cleared for landing. He put the review down and drank his coffee and looked at her with the expression she had been observing, across the 16 days of their marriage, slowly developing new layers. He took the review to his club that afternoon. She knew this because she heard him mention it to his secretary, instructing him to bring a second copy, and because Perkins reported, with the composed matter-of-factness of a lady's maid who takes her intelligence role seriously, that the morning room copy had also gone missing, which meant either 2 copies had left the house or 1 copy had been taken, read, and replaced for the appearance of innocence. She found this gratifying in a way she declined to examine too closely. The essay was the talk of the Athenaeum by Thursday evening. Isolde knew this because Phoebe Finch told her on Friday morning. Miss Phoebe Finch was Isolde's closest friend, a woman of 28 with a constitution for absurdity that she deployed in the service of what she called accurate reporting and everyone else called gossip, and who had been Isolde's primary source of social intelligence since the year they had met at a music-hall and discovered, within the first 10 minutes, that they were both reading the same illegal French novel under their programs. Phoebe had no interest in marrying anyone in particular, which she had decided at the age of 23 and had maintained with serene consistency, and which gave her the specific social freedom of someone who has nothing at stake and can therefore observe everything without the distorting lens of personal investment. She arrived at most situations slightly ahead of the information and usually slightly ahead of the people in the situation themselves, which she considered a service and which most people, once they recovered from the initial disruption, were forced to agree it was. She arrived at Ashcroft House on Friday morning with the expression she wore when she had something excellent and said, before she had fully sat down, "The Athenaeum is in uproar." "Over what?" said Isolde, who was managing a letter about drainage. "Not as interesting as the essay. The estate required it." "The essay in the Quarterly. A. Hartwell, Esquire." Phoebe looked at her with the dark eyes that had been reading people accurately since they were 19. "Half of them think it's Thackeray, which I find very funny, and the other half think it's Lord Fenchurch, which I find even funnier, because Lord Fenchurch has not said anything interesting about anything since 1849 and shows no signs of reversing this trend." "And what do you think?" Isolde said. "I think," Phoebe said, with the precision of a woman who has been the closest friend of someone for 7 years and has reliable calibration, "that it is the best thing I have read in 2 years and that A. Hartwell, Esquire is either a man of astonishing insight into the female experience of aristocratic marriage or a woman who has recently had the opportunity to study it from the inside." She paused. The wedding breakfast paragraph. The specific quality of observed detail in the wedding breakfast paragraph is not available to someone who attended as a guest. It is available to someone who attended as a principal and spent the experience doing something other than enjoying it. "Many people find wedding breakfasts taxing," Isolde said carefully. "They find them socially taxing," Phoebe said. "The essay's author found them analytically interesting. These are different responses and they belong to different people." She held Isolde's gaze without blinking. "Also, the toast. The bit about the best man's toast. A. Hartwell describes a best man's toast with the precision of someone who sat through one very recently and wrote about it the same night." "You are annoyingly thorough," Isolde said. "I am your best friend," Phoebe said, with the serenity of someone who considers these things equivalent. "It is why I am useful." "I think," Phoebe said, with the precision of a woman who has been the closest friend of someone for 7 years and has reliable calibration, "that it is the best thing I have read in 2 years and that A. Hartwell, Esquire is either a man of astonishing insight into the female experience of aristocratic marriage or a woman who has recently had the opportunity to study it from the inside." Isolde put down the drainage letter. She looked at Phoebe. "The desk," Phoebe said. "I beg your pardon. You told me 3 weeks ago you needed a proper writing desk in your rooms. You were very specific about the surface area." Phoebe picked up the teapot and poured with the ease of long familiarity. "And the wedding was the 15th. The essay was postmarked, I checked, because I am thorough, the 16th. "You checked the postmark," Isolde said. "I went to the Quarterly and asked the editor if the submission date was consistent with the cover letter's date. He was initially unhelpful. I mentioned that I was asking on behalf of Lady Ashcroft, which turned out to be very helpful." Isolde looked at her friend. "Did the editor deduce?" "He deduced nothing." Phoebe was serene. "He told me the submission came from a postal box in Kensington maintained in the name of A. Hartwell, as the cover letter indicated, and that the contributor had submitted before and been published before, and that he was delighted to publish this piece, which was, in his words, the sharpest thing he had read on the subject since Trollope." She sipped her tea. "So, wedding night essay." "I was perfectly occupied," Isolde said. Phoebe made a sound that was entirely unladylike and entirely characteristic. "You absolute," she collected herself. "Does he know?" He read it at breakfast and told me it was brutal. What did you say? I said it was honest and that they were different things. Phoebe stared at her. Isolde. I also agreed with his assessment of Aldous Fry's toast. Phoebe put down her cup. You sat across the breakfast table from your husband while he read your essay about his marriage and agreed with him about it. It was a good essay, Isolde said. I stand by it. Phoebe looked at her friend with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and alarm and was having difficulty committing to either. What is the plan, she said finally, with respect to all of this? Isolde considered the question with the serious attention she gave to legitimate strategic questions, which this was. The plan, insofar as she had one, was not a plan in the conventional sense of a series of steps toward a predetermined outcome. She had learned, across 26 years, that predetermined outcomes were less reliable than good positioning, and that good positioning meant understanding the landscape clearly and being prepared to move quickly. When the landscape shifted. The landscape was as follows: she was married to a man of intelligence and assumptions, both of which were considerable. The assumptions were the problem and also, given his intelligence, the solution, because assumptions that a man can see can be revised, and she had, in 16 days, observed him seeing several of his own with the slight, specific expression of a man revising in real time. The essay was not a weapon. It was a mirror, held at a careful angle. Whether anyone chose to look into it was their own business. The plan, she said, is to be exactly what I am, which is all I have ever had anyway, and to see what he makes of it. Phoebe absorbed this. And if he makes nothing of it? Then I will have a very interesting marriage to an obtuse man in a good house with excellent drainage once I fix the south field, Isolde said, and I will write about it, which will also be useful. Phoebe laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine, and refilled both their cups, and they moved on to the drainage and the question of whether Cecily's season was shaping up correctly and the general business of a friendship that had been the most reliable constant of Isolde's adult life and which she had no intention of allowing matrimony to diminish. The Duke, that same Friday, had given the essay to 3 men at his club and asked their opinions. He told himself he was doing this because the essay was interesting and worth discussing, which was true. He did not examine the additional reason, which was that he had been thinking about it for 36 hours with a frequency that suggested something beyond intellectual interest and that he was not yet ready to locate precisely. The 3 men at his club had the following responses. Lord Aldous Fry, his best man, said that A. Hartwell was clearly a radical and probably a foreigner and that the essay was the kind of thing that gave young women ideas. The Duke found this response so perfectly calibrated to be unhelpful that he moved on without comment, though he did note, privately and with the slight discomfort of accurate self-recognition, that Fry's response was itself a fairly precise illustration of the essay's central argument. Sir George Pemberton, no relation to Lavinia, a coincidence that the Duke noted with the irony available to a man whose evening had recently been educational in specific ways, said it was wickedly sharp and that whoever wrote it had been inside the machinery at very close range, which was an interesting observation from George, who had been married for 11 years and had the expression of a man with inside knowledge and no particular inclination to share it further than this. There was a 4th man the Duke had not initially intended to consult, which was his own conscience, but which had been working overtime since the previous Thursday and was becoming difficult to ignore. He sat in the leather armchair that he had occupied at his club for 9 years, on the particular cushion that had developed a comfortable topography of his exact weight and posture, surrounded by the deep, reliable quiet of a room full of men who were reading newspapers and mostly not speaking, and he read the essay again. The whole of it, from the first line about compatibility of circumstance to the last line about the system and the thing it was not designed to contain. The 3rd man, Lord Charles Hartwick, a barrister of genuine intelligence, read it carefully, set it down, and said, "This is a woman." The Duke looked at him. "The argument," Hartwick said. "Not the premise is available to anyone. The argument. The specific quality of observation about the wedding breakfast, the toasts, the ceremony. This is someone who has experienced these things from the inside of them recently and has the exact kind of mind that turns experience directly into argument without the layer of abstracting distance that men tend to apply." He tapped the page. "This is a woman who was recently married and is extremely clever. I'd look for the essay under a woman's name if there is one." The Duke sat with this for a moment. He said, "What would you do with that information, if you had it?" Hartwick looked at him. He was a perceptive man, Hartwick, and he looked at the Duke the way perceptive men look at people who have asked questions they are not ostensibly asking. "I would," he said, carefully, "be extremely interested in knowing her." The Duke sat with this. He sat with it through the remainder of his port and his return to the morning papers and the departure from the club and the carriage ride home, and what he sat with was not, he recognized, purely intellectual. It had the quality of something more personal than intellectual engagement. It had the quality of a thing that had been growing in the background of his attention for 16 days and had been attributed, by his conscious mind, to various other causes: the interest of the essay, the question of who had written it, the general stimulation of an unexpectedly animated marriage, and which was now, with the combined evidence of Hartwick's observation and his own 36 hours of thinking about a piece of writing his wife had produced on the first night of their marriage, refusing to be attributed to anything else. The carriage moved through London in its afternoon business. He looked out the window at the city, which had no particular opinion about his situation and offered no assistance, and he thought about the breakfast table and the port and the library at 2:30 in the morning. He thought about the way she had said your evening was instructive with the precision of a woman who was asking a question rather than making an accusation. He thought about the garden and oaks and the roses and the composure that was not performance but something more difficult, the composure of someone who is exactly what they are and is not managing it for your benefit. He thought about the policy that was suspended after the wedding. He went home. He went to the library, where his wife was not, because she was in the garden, which Perkins told him when he found the library empty and asked. He went to the garden, where Isolde was standing near the rose bed with the gardener, Mr. Oakes, and appeared to be in the middle of a conversation about pruning that had the character of two professionals consulting on a technical matter, neither of them performing the consultation. He stood at the garden door for a moment and watched. She was gesturing at the bed with the contained precision of someone who knows what she wants and has the vocabulary for it, and Oakes was listening with the attentive nod of a man who is receiving information that is actually useful. The afternoon was mild and the garden was lit with the particular quality of late May light that made London look, briefly, like somewhere you would have chosen. She turned and saw him, and the conversation with Oakes concluded with the ease of two people who understand they will resume it later, and she came toward him across the garden path with the unhurried confidence that was the quality he had noticed first, at the dinner party, and had been noticing at intervals ever since. "How are the roses?" he said. "Neglected," she said, "but salvageable. Oakes is excellent. He knows what he is doing. He just needs someone to tell him it is permissible to do it." He fell into step beside her and they walked the garden path in the afternoon light, and he thought about what Hartwick had said and about the essay and about the word clarifying in Lavinia's letter and about the library at 2:30 in the morning and the grey dressing gown and mill. "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may always ask," she said. "Whether I answer is a separate question." "What were you writing?" he said, "on our wedding night?" A pause of 3 steps. The gravel crunched under their feet. A bird somewhere in the garden addressed the afternoon with its opinion. "An essay," she said. "About marriage. As a structural phenomenon." "Yes." She looked ahead at the path. "I had been developing the argument for some weeks. The wedding night seemed like an appropriate occasion to commit it to paper, given that I had the material fresh and the time available." He was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the submission date and the postal address in Kensington and the specific quality of the argument that Hartwick had identified as belonging to a woman who was recently married and extremely clever. "Did you send it to anyone?" he said. "I sent it somewhere it would be read," she said. "Which is the destination one sends things to." He stopped walking. She stopped walking, because he had stopped, and turned to look at him. "Is a Hartwell Esquire an anagram?" he said. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the small, internal movement of a thing deciding whether to arrive at the surface. Then it arrived. "It is a truncation," she said, "of a name I considered no longer entirely my own, and not yet fully replaced by its successor." He looked at her. The garden was entirely quiet. The afternoon light sat on everything with its late May perfection and complete indifference to the fact that 2 people were standing on a gravel path while one of them understood, with the arriving completeness of something that has been approaching for 16 days, what he had married. "You wrote it," he said. "I did," she said. "On our wedding night. I was perfectly occupied." He stood with this for a moment. The essay he had read at breakfast and taken to his club and given to 3 men and discussed with the particular, slightly urgent quality of someone trying to understand why a thing was staying with them, was by the woman standing in front of him in the garden of his house, who had been sitting across the breakfast table when he read it and had agreed with him about Aldous Fry's toast. "The toast," he said, "was an excellent example of the type," she said. "I was glad you read it." "You were glad?" "I thought you would find it accurate," she said, with the composed simplicity of someone who has thought about this and is now saying what they thought. "The essay, I mean. I thought it was the kind of thing your mind would engage with. And I thought," she paused, the pause of someone choosing words with the precision of a craftsperson selecting tools, "I thought that the most honest thing I could offer, at the beginning of something that required honesty to be worth anything at all, was my actual thinking, rather than a performance of what I imagined was expected." He looked at her for a long time. The garden continued its serene indifference around them. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hour. The second to last paragraph, he said. About the thing the system was never designed to contain. The company of someone who sees them clearly, she said. And finds them worth the seeing. Yes. He looked at her. Was that directed at anything in particular? She looked back at him steadily, with the grey eyes that had been accurate about everything they had assessed since the dinner party at Lady Hartfield's. It was directed, she said, at the truth as I understood it at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 16th of May. Whether it is true in other contexts I am still determining. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said something that she would think about afterward, in the way that you think about things that arrive unexpectedly and contain more than you had prepared for. I owe you more than an apology for one evening. She looked at him. I assumed, he said, with the careful honesty of someone doing something difficult but doing it directly, because he had decided that directness was both more honorable and more efficient and was maintaining this position with the consistency that was, she had observed, one of his actual qualities beneath the assumptions. I assumed that this marriage was that the arrangement was, he stopped, and tried again, and she let him, because this was important and deserving of time and she was not going to fill the space just because there was space. I assumed I knew what this was. I arranged it accordingly. I was wrong about what it was, and I was wrong about you specifically, which is not the same failure but they are related. She held his gaze. She thought about what Phoebe had said the morning before, about the plan, and what she had answered, and she thought about the essay and the writing desk and the library at 2:30 and Mill and the garden conversation with Oakes and the 16 days of mornings and breakfasts and evenings in which a marriage had been, quietly and without her husband's full attention, already underway. Wrong about me specifically, she said. In what way? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I thought you were doing what people do, he said. I thought you were managing an arrangement, performing an acceptable version of a wife for the purpose of a workable outcome. I did not think, he paused. I did not think you were simply being yourself. I have always been simply being myself, she said. It is considerably less effort than the alternative. I know, he said, and his voice had in it the quality she had heard twice before, at the dinner party over the Elgin marbles and in the library at 2:30. The quality of a man encountering something that has exceeded what he was prepared for. I know that now. I did not know it 3 weeks ago. To be fair, she said, after a moment, you had not been looking. No, he agreed. I had not. The garden was still. The late afternoon was moving toward evening with the unhurried English progress of late May. A door somewhere inside the house opened and closed, releasing a brief drift of warmth and the smell of something being prepared for dinner. I should like to begin looking, he said. If that is still available. She considered him with the honest, patient attention she had brought to this from the beginning, the attention that assessed rather than performed, that looked for what was actually there rather than what was wanted to be there. She saw the same face she had been studying across breakfasts and libraries and garden paths and one very good parliamentary debate at a dinner party, the face of a man who was, beneath the considerable architecture of his assumptions, genuinely intelligent, and who had the quality, rarer in her experience than intelligence itself, of being capable of revising when the evidence demanded it. I will make you a proposal, she said. You are making me a proposal. A second proposal. To supplement the first, which was arrived at by somewhat different means. She held his gaze. You look at me as though I am worth looking at. I will extend you the same courtesy. And we will proceed from there, with the understanding that the essay stands as published and I will not apologize for it, and that the arrangement with your separate establishment is terminated as of this conversation, and that if you wish to argue about Middlemarch, he said, and his expression did something she had not previously seen it do, which was open, fully and without the management of the social surface, into genuine, unguarded amusement. You want to argue about Middlemarch. I want to argue about everything, she said, with the directness of someone who has spent 26 years wanting this and is done pretending otherwise. I want to argue about Gladstone and Mill and the Southfield drainage and the rose bed and whether In Memoriam is primarily a poem about grief or a poem about the reconstruction of faith after grief and whether the Elgin marbles constitute a rescue or a theft, on which I have not changed my position and do not expect to, and I want to do all of it in the company of someone who is actually arguing back rather than performing the argument. That is what I want. That is what I have always wanted, and it is the only thing I want from this marriage that is actually mine to want, and I am asking whether you want it too. He was quiet for a long moment. The garden held its breath around them. Somewhere in London, the evening was beginning its slow, magnificent progress, the gas lamps coming on in their succession along the long avenues, the city settling into the particular quality of itself that arrived at dusk and had nothing to do with the morning version. The Elgin marbles, he said, are not a rescue. She looked at him. We agree on that. I thought? I know what you thought at the dinner party, she said. You were wrong. I was being polite. He stared at her. You were being polite. It was our first conversation. I have a policy. She paused. The policy is suspended after the wedding. He looked at her, at the grey eyes and the composure and the woman who had written an essay on their wedding night and sat across the breakfast table while he read it and agreed with him about the toast and asked Oakes about the roses with the precision of someone who has studied what a thing requires and intends to provide it, and he did the last thing she had prepared herself for, which was that he laughed. Not the brief, surprised version she had produced twice before. The full version, genuine and generous, the laugh of a man who has found something so precisely and specifically funny that containment is simply not an option, and who has, in finding it, also found something else that he is going to need some additional time to correctly identify. Suspended after the wedding, he said, when the laugh had finished. Good God! How many conversations have you had on that policy? All of them, she said. Until the policy was suspended. He shook his head, still with the residue of the laugh on his face, and she looked at him with the faint, private pleasure of someone who has produced something good and knows it. I owe you, he said, an extremely thorough argument about Middlemarch. You owe me several, she said. We have 16 days of suppressed opinion to recover. They walked back to the house in the evening light, not touching, because they were still in the early days of being people who were learning what proximity meant, and the early days required some patience, and she was a patient woman when patience was actually warranted. He walked beside her with the quality she had been observing since the garden conversation, the slightly different quality of a man whose internal architecture is being revised and who is aware of this and is not resisting it, which was new in him and which she was watching with the careful interest of someone who has made an investment and is monitoring its progress. You said earlier, he said, as they turned the corner of the rose bed, that you have been managing something carefully. She did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes. In order to assess it accurately. Correct. Is the assessment complete? She considered this with the seriousness she gave to legitimate questions. The evening was warm and the garden smelled of the roses that wanted attention, and the air had the particular quality of a London evening in late May when the city has decided, briefly and without commitment, to be agreeable. The primary assessment is complete, she said. There are subsidiary questions still under review. Such as? Whether the man I am assessing understands that the essay about marriage was not a complaint, she said. It was an observation. There is a distinction. Complaints require a remedy. Observations require acknowledgement. He was quiet for a moment. I understood it as an observation, he said. That is why I quoted it to 3 men at my club rather than presenting it to you as evidence of wrongdoing. She looked sideways at him. You quoted it to 3 men at your club. And one of them identified the author correctly without being told. Hartwick, she said. He's the only one in that club with the necessary precision. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, because he had stopped, which was the natural consequence of walking beside someone and is not, she would have told anyone who asked, a romantic gesture, merely a practical one. He looked at her in the garden light with the expression she was still naming, that had been forming since the breakfast table and the port and the Middlemarch argument, that had the quality of something decided. Hartwick also said, the Duke told her, that he would be extremely interested in knowing the woman who wrote it. She held his gaze steadily. I hope you told him she was taken, she said. He looked at her. A pause of 2 seconds, in which she could see him, for once, having absolutely no prepared response, which was the most satisfying 2 seconds she had experienced since the dinner party. Then, I told him nothing, he said. I went home. Next time, she said, beginning to walk again, tell him she is taken. He held the garden door for her and she passed through it and said, without looking back, I am told the Quarterly is considering a second essay. By A. Hartwell, Esquire, he said. By his close associate, she said. A. Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft. He stopped. She continued into the house, toward the drawing room and the fire that would be lit and the evening that was waiting, and after a moment he followed, because there was nowhere else to be that was going to be remotely as interesting. They argued about Middlemarch at dinner. It lasted an hour and covered Dorothea Brooke and the nature of failed marriages and the question of whether Eliot was writing a tragedy or a comedy about the same material, and ended with both of them having revised one position and defended 3, which was, by Isolde's standard, a successful exchange. The port was good. The fire was good. The argument was better. He told her, over the port, about Lavinia's letter. He did this with the directness of someone who has decided that honesty is better and who is maintaining the decision even when maintaining it means saying things that are not comfortable to say. He told her about the Paris departure and the word clarifying and the postscript about the wife being more interesting than either of them had believed. She listened to all of it. She thought about Lavinia Pemberton, whom she had never met but about whom she had, through Phoebe's comprehensive intelligence network, a reasonably clear picture, with the honest fairness of a woman who understood that the situation was more complicated than villains and victims and who preferred accurate assessment to comfortable simplification. She thought about what Lavinia's departure meant and what it had cost her to go, and she thought it had probably cost more than the Paris framing suggested, and she thought that Lavinia Pemberton was a woman of practical intelligence and that practical intelligence sometimes looked, from a distance, like coldness, and was not. The postscript, she said. About finding me more interesting than expected. Yes. She sounds, Isolde said carefully, like someone worth knowing. He looked at her. That is a remarkable response to that information. It is an accurate response, she said. She has good judgment. The Paris timing was also good judgment. And she writes a persuasive postscript. She met his eyes with the steady, grey directness that he had been looking at for 6 weeks and was only now, she thought, actually seeing. I am not threatened by a woman who made a correct assessment and acted on it with good timing. I am threatened by situations I cannot understand. This one I can understand. He was quiet for a moment. I underestimated you, he said. You did, she agreed, without either resentment or performance. Most people do, in the beginning. It is not a permanent condition if they are paying attention. I am paying attention, he said. I know, she said. You have been paying attention for approximately 16 days. You are getting considerably better at it. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had been watching develop across the dinner and the port and the argument about Middlemarch, the expression she had been waiting to see form into something definite and was now seeing form, which was the expression of a man who has been looking at something all along and has just understood what he was looking at. Isolde, he said. Caspian, she said. They looked at each other across the dinner table with the fire going and the port between them and the sound of the house around them settling into night. The essay, he said. The second paragraph from the end. The thing the system was not designed to contain. The company of someone who sees you clearly and finds you worth the seeing, she said. Yes. A pause, and she could see him choosing words, not for management but for accuracy, which was the mode she valued. I think I am, he stopped. He tried again. I have been in this marriage for 16 days and I have read your essay at my breakfast table and taken it to my club and given it to 3 men and thought about it for 36 hours, and I did not understand why until about an hour ago. And now, she said. And now, he said, I understand that I have been arguing with the same person since a dinner party in March, and that the arguing is the point, and that the point is, he stopped again, and then, with the decision of a man who has found that precision is better than approximation even when precision is difficult, I would like to find out if I am in love with you, or whether I already am, and I believe the fastest way to determine this is to be honest with you about it and see what you say. She looked at him with the amber-adjacent grey eyes, and she thought about the essay and the desk and the library at 2:30 and the garden and the argument about the Elgin marbles at the dinner party when she had been polite, because it was their first conversation and she had a policy. She thought about the policy being suspended. I think, she said, that you may already be and have not caught up to the information yet. This is consistent with what I have observed of you. And you, he said. She looked at the fire. She looked at the port. She looked at the man across the table who had assumed things and been wrong about them and had said so directly and without management, which was the quality she had said was better than pretense at the beginning of all this and which he was, she observed, actually possessing. I think, she said, with the precision she brought to all true things, that I am inclined in your direction. I have been for some time. I have been managing it carefully in order to arrive at a position from which I could assess it accurately, which is how I approach things, and the assessment is that it is real rather than gratitude, which was my primary concern. He stared at her. You were managing it. It requires management, she said. Otherwise you say things before you have verified them, and I have a strong preference for verified things. That is, he said, the most scientific. I am a methodical person, she said. You will find this useful in most contexts. He laughed again, the real, full version, and she allowed herself the private pleasure of it, which was the pleasure she had been experiencing across 16 days of an unexpected marriage and had been managing carefully in order to arrive at a position from which she could assess it accurately, and which was, now that the assessment was complete, something she intended to stop managing. She reached across the table and picked up the port decanter and refilled his glass, and then her own, and set it back between them. There is one more thing, she said. Yes. He was still smiling, which was a new configuration of his face and one she found, she allowed herself to note, extremely agreeable. The second essay, she said. By A. Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft. What about it? I intend to continue writing them, she said. Under that name. About whatever seems worth writing about. She held his gaze steadily, because this was the thing that was actually hers and had been hers before the marriage and would be hers after it regardless of what the marriage became. This is not a negotiation. I am informing you. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived, across one dinner, at the understanding that his assumptions about his marriage were wrong in the specific and considerable way that will require years of revision, which he is finding, against all probability and his own prior expectations, not alarming but genuinely interesting. The quarterly editor, he said. Is he expecting the second essay? He is hopeful, she said. What is the subject? I have not decided yet, she said. But I am considering an essay about the peculiar experience of being underestimated by someone intelligent. The comedy it produces. The ways in which it eventually rectifies itself, if everyone behaves with reasonable honesty. He was quiet for a moment. Will the Duke in question be identifiable? The essay will contain no dukes, she said. It will contain a collection of structural observations about a general phenomenon. And the Duchess? The Duchess, she said, will not be available for identification. She will be, in the essay, simply a woman of particular clarity of mind who has found herself in a situation that proved, against moderate odds, to be worth the trouble. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire had gone low and the port was good and London was conducting itself outside the windows with its magnificent, indifferent continuity, entirely unaware that inside a house in Mayfair, a marriage was being started, properly, for the first time. Worth the trouble, he said. Provisional assessment, she said. Subject to ongoing review. How long, he said, until the assessment is final? She picked up her glass. I expect, she said, with the precision that was her primary characteristic and that he was, she had decided, actually beginning to deserve, that it will require some years and a substantial quantity of argument. Possibly all of Gladstone. Definitely the Elgin marbles. Certainly Middlemarch, on which I expect you to revise your position by the end of the summer, because you are wrong and the evidence for this is in the text and you are a man who responds to evidence. I am, he said. I have recently demonstrated this. You have, she agreed. It is, I will admit, among your more useful qualities. What are my other useful qualities? Your income is 70,000 a year, she said. I have already mentioned the marbles. And you argue back. She set down the glass. That is the most important one. You argue back. Do not stop doing that. He looked at her with the full, open expression that had no social performance left in it, the expression of a man who has arrived, via a route he had not planned and a direction he had not anticipated, at something he had not known he was looking for. I have absolutely no intention, he said, of stopping that. And that was, more or less, how it began. Not on the 15th of May, at St. George's, with the vows and the signing and the collective goodwill. Not over the champagne and Aldous Fry's toast, which remained, as a piece of oratory, professionally competent at best. Not in the carriage, or at the dinner, or in the 16 days of careful circling that preceded the garden and the conversation about the essay and the argument about Middlemarch. It began on the evening of the 31st of May, 1863, over port and the dying fire, when two people who had been in the same room as each other for 6 weeks and looking at each other for a fraction of that time stopped, finally and completely, performing the versions of themselves that rooms required and sat in the actual company of each other, which was the thing the system had never been designed to contain and which turned out, as the best things tend to have been there all along. The second essay was published in the Quarterly on the 3rd of July. It was titled On the Pleasures of Revising an Incorrect First Impression, a Field Study. It was attributed to A. Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft, which caused, upon publication, the kind of delicious, rattling, thoroughly enjoyable uproar in the drawing rooms and clubs and breakfast tables of London that lasts approximately 3 weeks and is then replaced by something else, because London is always interested in the next thing. What it also caused, which London did not discuss because it did not know, was the Duke of Ashcroft reading it at breakfast on the 4th of July and saying, after a long moment, "This is very good." "Thank you," his wife said. "You should write about the drainage," he said. She looked up. "The South Field? The whole problem. The approach you've been taking. It's the same problem on 3 other estates I know of, and nobody has written about it clearly." He turned a page. "You think clearly about systems. You should apply it." She looked at him with the grey eyes and the precise, unperformed pleasure of someone receiving something exactly right. "A woman writing about drainage," she said. "In the Quarterly. Under A. Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft," he said. "Who is now, as far as the Quarterly's readership is concerned, a figure of considerable authority." He looked at her over the review. "Besides, you were right about the clay soil in the second to last paragraph of your last letter to the estate manager, and I told him to proceed accordingly, and he did, and it is working. You should publish that thinking rather than putting it in letters." She looked at her husband. She thought about the dinner party at Lady Hartfield's and the Elgin marbles and the essay written in 4 hours on the night she had been told would be the beginning of something and which had turned out to be, in the way of most important beginnings, not what anyone had planned. The drainage essay, she said. Unless you have something more pressing. I always have something more pressing, she said. I will make room. He returned to the parliamentary coverage. She returned to the toast. The clock marked the hour. Mrs. Groves moved somewhere in the house with the quiet efficiency of someone managing an establishment that had acquired, in the space of 6 weeks, a new kind of order, not the imposed order of correct procedure, but the organic order of a household in which two people were learning the particular, irreplaceable pleasure of being genuinely known by someone who finds them, in the full and honest accounting, worth the knowing. Outside, London conducted itself with its usual magnificent indifference. Inside, a duke read his newspaper and a duchess planned a drainage essay, and both of them were, in their separate and overlapping ways, doing exactly what the institution they had entered together had never been designed to produce, and which they had arrived at anyway, through the unlikely combination of an honest conversation, a postal address in Kensington, and an essay written in 4 hours on a night that was supposed to be about something else entirely. On the 1st of June, a letter arrived at Ashcroft House from Paris. It was from Mrs. Lavinia Pemberton, addressed to the Duchess of Ashcroft, and it said, "I understand you wrote the essay. I thought it was magnificent. I also thought the last paragraph was the truest thing anyone has published on the subject in 20 years. The address here is good through August. Do write." Isolde read it twice. She wrote back the same afternoon. The correspondence that followed was, Phoebe would note the following season, the most interesting epistolary friendship she had witnessed in years, which was saying something, because Phoebe had witnessed a considerable number. And the Duke of Ashcroft, who had gone to his mistress on his wedding night and found her already in Paris and come home to find his wife at the writing desk and read the resulting essay at his breakfast table and argued about Middlemarch and the drainage and the Elgin marbles and Gladstone with progressive thoroughness across the summer and autumn and winter that followed, revised his position on Middlemarch in October, which she had predicted with complete accuracy and which he acknowledged. With the directness she had asked of him and received with the pleasure that accurate predictions, when you care about the person who made them, always produce. He told her she had been right about the clay soil. She told him he had been right about the North Rose bed. They argued about everything else with the engaged, genuine, thoroughly entertained quality of two people who have found in each other the specific, rare, system-defeating thing the essay had described in its second-to-last paragraph, which was the company of someone who sees you clearly and finds you, in the full and unvarnished accounting, worth the seeing. The drainage essay was published in November. It was the best piece on the subject the Quarterly had run in a decade and generated, among the estate managers of 3 counties, the kind of serious correspondence that is the highest possible compliment available to someone who writes about drainage. The Duke framed the first letter. He put it in the library, on the mantelpiece, next to the first edition Middlemarch he had given her in September when he conceded the argument. She found both items there on a Tuesday morning and stood in the library doorway looking at them for a moment with the expression she had when something arrived precisely right. Then she sat down at the desk, the proper, broad-surfaced, practical desk that had been there on the first night and had served every purpose she had required of it since, and she began the next thing. Because there was always a next thing. That, she had found, was the best possible thing about a marriage built on the right foundation. There was always, always, a next thing. And somewhere in the London of 1863, arriving at breakfast tables on Thursday mornings with the composed reliability of something that has been doing this for 40 years and expects to continue, the London Quarterly Review was already being read, and argued about, and quoted, and the name A. Hartwell, Duchess of Ashcroft, was becoming the kind of name that people mentioned in the specific tone reserved for people who are worth mentioning, which is the only tone that matters and the only monument worth building. Which was, as Isolde had always understood, entirely the point. If this story made you laugh out loud, or made you put your hand to your chest, or made you think about what it actually means to be seen by someone rather than merely looked at, then it was for you. The sharpest love stories are the ones where both people have to earn each other, where no one is handed anything, where the wit and the warmth and the getting it wrong and then getting it right are all in the same breath, all in the same room, all conducted over port and a dying fire by two people who are, slowly and verifiably and with the full application of their intelligence, falling in love. Subscribe to the Lantern Stories. Tell us in the comments which moment made you spit your tea, because there should have been at least one. Like this video, share it with the person in your life who would write an essay on their wedding night and consider it an entirely reasonable use of the time. And find our next story at the end of this one. Thank you for your laughter, which is the best thing we make here.